I mean, we could just keep NTO and rebrand it as not trusted outputs.
Not trusted.
That's too controversial.
By whom? Yeah. That's the problem. Because again, like I trust a lot of these outputs, but it's just the ref managers do not.
I do like non-trusted, but again, I don't want to somehow degrade them in any way, shape, or form because they are excellent. So we don't want to somehow put a synonym, which means that needs to be reconsidered in any way, shape, or form.
So but, the ultimate thing is, what we should be calling them is outputs.
Yes.
Right? That's what it should be because they're all outputs.
But then we don't distinguish our mission. So it's, we kind of have to say all outputs.
That's the
NTSOs, non-traditionally submitted output, is exactly what we mean, but we've already got NTOs out there. The ref is referring to it as diverse outputs.
Now, you see, I don't think we'd be having this discussion if they hadn't moved to diverse outputs, because now there are two different names. One will be used by the sort of mainstream ref and one will be used by us. And so
but then again, I would like to think that the ref wouldn't have that discussion without us talking about NTOs too. So chicken and egg, and egg.
So far in our discussions, and I don't believe our discussions are finished yet, I think not traditionally submitted outputs is as close as we're getting to what the truth of the matter is. If you want to adequately describe the outputs that we want to see submitted, you have to use sort of 6 or 7 words in a phrase. And that's just so unwieldy to be entirely unhelpful. But I think not traditionally submitted outputs might be the way forward.
Welcome to What the Ref, the podcast about everyone's favourite research assessment exercise. I'm James.
I'm Gemma.
And I'm Simon.
And in this month's episode, we're going to talk about what the ref has been happening this month. We're going to talk about a little trip that Gemma and Simon made to Bath. And we're going to talk about NTOs or non-traditional outputs. So, Gemma, what the ref has been happening this month?
What the ref happened this month? It's been quite a quiet month. I guess that the submissions for the panelists for the Unit of Assessment subpanels and main panels closed this month. So I guess we'll be hearing a little bit more about who is on those panels. And those panels, can I say, are very large. They can be anything from 10 to 45 members. So watch this space. There was a very interesting letter written about the PCE statement, basically anti-EDI, which perhaps is best to ignore at this point in time, but is very interesting and heightening up the debate around PCE as a legitimate measure of research culture excellence. And also, Simon and I went to Bath. We had a lot of fun. We started talking to Bath about the Hidden Ref competition, the ETI project, and what we have in plan for non-traditional outputs between now and 2029. Simon, do you want to update everyone on that?
Yeah, certainly can. So the things that I think were really exciting this month, the submissions closed for the ref panels, but what I'm interested in is with the results of when these come through, and we can start seeing like actually who are going to be doing these assessments. There are a lot of people. So, I mean, you were saying up to 45 people, Gemma. I mean, there's on a panel. So how many we talked about overall? A couple of 100, 300 people in total?
I think we can actually question, like, after all of the things that we all know and hear about the ref, what the ref are people thinking when they put themselves forward as a ref panelist? It's a thankless job, but it's a job that they do in service of the entire research community. So it'll be interesting to look at that in more depth.
So I really fair to say, Gemma, you're the most excited person in the UK to find out who these people are going to be?
Oh, yeah, I'm the ref nerd junkie. Yeah, totally. I am watching every little bit.
So I want to look at the background of these people. I want to see, because obviously, we're pushing for a broader interpretation of what success looks like in research. And the way that you get that is by obviously getting lots of submissions in from all of these non-traditional outputs that we've been promoting. But if those non-traditional outputs come across panels where people are very traditional and they expect to see publications, then what's the result of that going to be? We're going to see the same thing that happened in 2008, 2014, and 2021. And I know Research England are really passionate about getting a more diverse representation on these panels. But what will actually happen? Because ultimately, it's the people who apply, that's the pool that you can draw from. So if we haven't done our job of promoting this to a broad range of people, we'll end up with panels that are made up of traditional researchers once again.
And I think what we have to also say is that the main objective behind these panels is to prepare for the panels for the type of submissions that they're going to receive. And yet, if we still see the same thing that we saw in Ref 2014 and 2021, where a very small minority of non-traditional outputs are submitted to the panels for consideration, then you need to make sure that obviously the balance of expertise is going to be towards assessing traditional outputs, not non-traditional outputs. So it's a very interesting balancing game and balancing uncertainty with, idealized ideas about what we want to do. On the one hand, we want to encourage as many, non-traditional outputs to be submitted to the panels, but at the same time, without knowing what universities are going to submit, and it is the universities that make this decision, let's be clear, you have to somehow prepare the panel for what you anticipate. So even if, you get 2.4% or 3% of the overall submissions non-traditional outputs, that still equates to like one or maybe two people on the panel that are specifically for that. And as we'll explore later, the non-traditional outputs are a very, very broad range of outputs. So is it possible to have a non-traditional output evaluator on the panel who can evaluate every type of non-traditional output? I think that's a very, very difficult task. So I do not envy the ref panels making these decisions right now.
No, not at all. I'll say the other interesting thing, this is, I don't think the word secretariat and interesting have ever been used together in a sentence, but I'm about to do it. The other interesting thing is that the secretariat have been announced, and these are the people who are the kind of experts, the sort of policy experts who work across panels and answer panelists' questions about the ref guidelines and procedures. Now, I do wonder whether this issue of, every panel can't have the right number of software experts and the right number of musical composition experts and all these different areas of expertise. But I wonder if there could be something that's a bit like the secretariat. So you could have data experts who would go and advise the panels around data outputs and, patent experts that would do it around patent applications. So maybe that's one way of dealing with the expertise problems without having to find a huge number of people to join the panels.
Well, ideally, that's where the RDAP, the Research Diversity Advisory Panel, would come in to act. So the RDAP in the previous REF iterations was focused on interdisciplinary units. So if you had like a computer science article submitted to a sociology panel, you wanted to make sure that regardless of which panel it was going to be submitted to, that it had sufficient expertise to review it and that it was reviewed fairly so that it would score the same in a computer science panel as it would in a sociology panel. And that was to give, interdisciplinary research a much fairer approach to evaluation, because it is unfortunately a quite well documented fact that when people come across something that they are unaware of, they either really critique it or they're exceedingly generous. And both sides of that spectrum is not the same as giving it its due consideration to be able to evaluate it fairly and balanced towards what it is in world standards. And that can be even more tricky when you're talking about non-traditional outputs.
Okay, so we're talking then about growing this group of people involved in the kind of evaluation of ref submissions even further, potentially then. I'm not sure we necessarily want that, right? But
well, there's two things on this, and name check here, previous research on mine and a lot of other people, but specifically mine, on this is that there's always a balance between representation. So how many people do you have that represent non-traditional outputs on it? And the other is about inclusion. So are they listened to on the panel? So when you're talking about a panel of up to 45, sometimes more panelists, and the majority of them are traditional researchers in disciplined lots. So every unit of assessment is more or less like mapped on to a type of discipline. So some disciplines are far more impenetrable than other disciplines, for example. And so they have a very, very, very deep socialized embedded idea about what research excellence looks like in their output. So you might put a software person on this panel, or let's just take an example. You might put a software panel on an economics panel because there's a software person there. But whether or not they're listened to when it comes to evaluating the output and whether those ideas are actually considered equal to the ideas put forward by other more traditional academics who don't have the experience when it comes to non-traditional outputs because they have been focused on producing monographs, books, and journal articles, whether or not their expertise is equated to that is actually a far more difficult process when it comes to panel dynamics than we actually just having them there. But for REF, for example, they want to make sure that the first step is making sure that they're there. The second step is how to include them in the conversation and make sure that they're not sidelined by more dominant views within the panel.
One way to not be sidelined by more dominant views is to make sure that there are enough people with that expertise representing people on the panels. But then, yes, we have this issue, then the panels get larger and larger as we try and ensure that there are a sufficient number of experts in each different area. So it's an incredibly difficult problem.
So you've got a question of efficiency there. The larger the panel, the more inefficient it becomes because there's more noise, more disagreement. And sometimes this is a good thing. You do not want to put a submission in and everyone goes, oh yeah, that's 4-star, so that they're acting really efficiently, but they're not actually making the best decisions. But at the same time, a panel gets larger, it's more noise, it's difficult to negotiate, it's difficult to resolve arguments purely because it's so big. And yet these panels need to be done in a particular point in time. We want the results in 2030. We don't want the results in 2034, So there's a certain limit where the discussion needs to get to in order to have the optimate way of considering and deliberating around the quality of this. But anything past that, where, you get more and more people on the panel, means that there's questions of efficiency and whether or not you're going to change the outcome in any way, shape or form in the first place. So it's really, really difficult psychological process, and panels are fascinating. And I've been watching panels in various stages and at various points in the research evaluation process for many, many, many years now. And I am always fascinated when going in about the dynamics that are at play when considering these nuanced, very ambiguous aspects of impact, excellence, non-traditional output experts, research culture experts. I mean, what does that mean?
So do we know when they're going to be announced? Because I was looking on the website the other day trying to find out, when can we start scheduling, looking into the background of some of these people, but I couldn't find anything.
I have no idea, actually. Mm-hmm. I would expect it would take, we're talking about a very, very in-depth process, and we're going into summer. So I'd be surprised to see anything before summer, but we'll see. We'll keep our eyes and ears open, won't we?
So I have another update, another thing that happened this month. It was a quiet month, like Gemma was saying, but Jessica Corner wrote a blog on the UKRI website all about PCE, and kind of basically in the defense of PCE and explaining why that's an important part of the REF submission. I thought, it didn't go into a huge amount of depth, but it did say, it really made the case for the fact that the environment in which research takes place is a fundamental part of whether that research is successful, efficient, productive, all these other things. So I thought that was a really good read. I do suggest people take a look.
And I guess that's appeared in the context of a lot of noise around PC more broadly. And I'm not going to go into specifics of some of that noise, but kind of what I think that's important about that statement is it doesn't sort of close it down, but I think it gives universities reassurance that there's not going to be massive fluctuations in what's going to go on with PCE, because institutions are already preparing for it. They need to have trust in the process. They need to know it's not going to suddenly disappear. And already starting to do some of the kind of trials of that work as well. So,
yeah, but God forbid, like a new criterion to measure research in a different way would come out with a different result than the embedded hierarchy of institutions in this country. Like, yeah, that's the worst possible thing that could happen. I also think that the whole point of a new criterion, and can I just say, all of this moral panic sounds like Impact in 2012. Like, we've been here before. If you are going to index the efficiency of an indicator to measure something new about research, to recreating the structured hierarchy of, research excellence in this country, then there's no point in having it in the first place. And so I think that all the noise I would gather is probably more to do with institutions that have very, very stiff ways of doing things that are perhaps not commensurate with a good research culture, are running scared. And I think this means it's all very good for research culture, actually, because something needs to change. We know that research doesn't work inclusively. We know that it doesn't work efficiently. We know that not necessarily the best research is funded or promoted in any way, shape, or form. We have a huge gender pay gap. We have a huge racial pay gap. We have all of these systemic problems. I think the PCE criterion is an amazing opportunity to instigate change within this culture about how research is done. But if it has people worried and running because they're scared of how it will look, that makes me think that perhaps it's working better than they think it is.
I guess the one area where I do have a tiny bit of sympathy with some of the qualms is you mentioned systemic issues. I mean, we do, and we're not going to go into this in full, right, because this is not the space for it, but we do have systemic issues with higher education at the moment. And I think some institutions are, and indeed researchers who work in different parts of the sector are genuinely worried that this kind of requirement is coming in at a time where their research environment is in flux because of job losses and things like that. So I think that's one of the contexts in which hopefully over time Research England can reassure that this is not going to be a sort of institutions that have had systemic things gone wrong aren't penalized for things outside of what's going on in research, but rather they are judged on the ways in the context of their situation they are able to create a good environment in which research can be conducted.
I'm sympathetic to that. I really, really am, James. But if not now, when? And if we keep on kicking it down because now is not the best time, then it will never happen. I think Ref 2021 was originally going to be Ref 2020, but it was put back because of a huge, huge, huge disruption, which was caused by the COVID pandemic. And yeah, it was huge. And what that COVID pandemic, one of the many things that it did is it really highlighted and exacerbated existing inequities and inefficiencies and horrible working conditions within, research under higher education institutes in this country. And we're specifically talking about research because that's what we're looking at. And yet to say, oh, now is not the best time for us to instigate a measure of, how well the environment supports research. After a shock at that level, I see that as just basically reinforcing the status quo, not necessarily moving research forward. So yes, I sympathize that it is a difficult time, but it's never going to be perfect right time. And if you keep on waiting for the perfect time, it's never going to happen.
I should be super clear. I'm not suggesting that we don't do it because of that. Like, I think that it's more that I can see why something that is probably in the background for most people, they're kind of starting to understand the process of ref that is emerging in front of them. They're confronted with this relatively new thing they've probably not heard of before and are seeing in the context what's going on around them and going, well, why are they doing this now? I think it does need to happen. I think actually, if anything, that kind of instability within the sector might be actually mitigated to some extent by bringing in this kind of evaluation that enables longer term planning. I think it's just that I can see why there are qualms around, but I know I'm fully behind it happening.
I know. I didn't see you as a nameser or anything, James, but I think it just needs to be said because I don't think that any more noise about, no, it's not the right time. It's not measure. It makes, me look bad in my Russell Group University. I don't think that's particularly helpful. And I just wanted to, this is for entertainment's sake as well. So to put the other side, that being saying, all of these things sound like, again, 2012 when it came to the impact agenda, and all credit to the REF team over the last, 20 or so years. It's a highly professional organization and it's a highly professionalized movement. They've done this before with new criterion. And in the absence of anything proving otherwise, I really have a lot of faith in the REF team to move this forward in an effective way. And whether or not the institutions agree with it or take it on board, that's an institutional decision.
I must admit, I have sympathy with them, with the people who are pushing back against the PCE because they don't understand really what they need to do yet. So, looking at the PCE pilot that's just closed a couple of weeks ago, is it? I talked to some of the people who were involved in putting their pilot submissions together, and they were just, we've got this very open document to write and we're not entirely sure how to do it. I mean, obviously it's the pilot, and that's the part of the reason that they did it is so that they can understand the kind of submissions that are coming in and where people will need guidance. But people are finding it really difficult. And that is where I think it mirrors the research impact first coming in. I still remember when that came in, an EPSRC representative getting absolutely eviscerated on stage in front of a community of people who were just, so, well, what does it mean? How do you measure it? And the problem with any change like this is you need experience. So you need to have that experience so you can build up an understanding of how to put a PCE submission together. I think one of the big problems is, because we're only doing this every 7 years, it's actually quite difficult to retain that experience, and so that it's around to help for the next ref.
So, Simon, Gemma, do you want to talk about your trip to Bath?
Yes, I think we can talk about our trip to Bath. So it was really interesting. We were invited, as we have been, to talk to a lot of different universities by Hayley Shaw and Siobhan Williams, and they wanted us to talk about non-traditional outputs, hidden roles, the kind of work that we're doing. Yeah, so we had a really interesting talk, and there were a lot of questions, the kind of things that we see coming up a lot. One of them was around, what are you calling these non-traditional outputs? Are you sticking with that name? And I think we should get onto that subject matter, because that's really at the forefront of my mind at the moment.
Yeah, so looking at non-traditional outputs, well, it's a name that we coined when we were talking about the REF, weren't we? And also because NTOs was an acronym that just came off the tongue very well. But then
so do you want to very briefly describe sort of that split effectively? So traditionals come up, non-traditionals come up. Can someone just sort of give us an overview to our listeners of what we really mean when we're using that at the moment?
So we use non-traditional output because what we were referring to was really non-traditionally submitted output. So those outputs that are not seen by institutions or research organizations as competitive enough to go into the REF. And that is reflected in the fact that the vast majority of submissions that are put into the REF for the output submissions are journal articles, books, or monographs.
And can anyone remember the percentage in the last REF that were
2.4%?
No, the other. Yes. Okay. So
the other way around.
Yeah. Sorry.
97.4.
90.
Yeah.
So it's a huge amount. So that we were talking about non-traditional submitted outputs, but then again, not every discipline sees the types of outputs that are not journal articles, books, or monographs as non-traditionals. Exhibition and performance, which are both accessible outputs for the REF 2029 and 2021 and 2014, are quite traditional when it comes to theatre studies, drama studies, even any types of arts, etc. Same with software. But we should actually say here the killer fact is that you would think that software and databases would be pretty traditional for computer science, but the unit of assessment number 11, computer science, has never put a piece of software forward for the REF. So what we're talking about is non-traditional outputs, but really what we're referring to is non-traditionally submitted outputs.
Do we know, I did mean to check that unit of assessment, but do we know that computer science has never put forward a piece of software or data?
I thought the thing we knew was that they didn't last time.
The never came from Rebecca Fairbairn, so she was the one that we got that from.
So that's the director of the REF. So I think that one needs further research. I'm really interested to choose a couple of fields and then see how frequently they submit things that are associated with them, software and computer science, for example, and see how often what percentage of non-traditional outputs they put in. But on the name, I mean, it was quite a contentious discussion amongst the Hidden Ref committee. I remember when we were kind of, what name are we going to choose? And because I at the time favoured non-publication outputs, but as people pointed out, there's lots of non-traditionally submitted outputs that are publications of a form, so that didn't work.
Well, and also there's a lot of the things that are not books, publications, and articles, which are publications.
Yeah.
I think that was my particular.
Hang on, redo that. How are things not publications but are publications?
Well, no, but a book and a journal are publications, right? But there are other forms of things you can, like a report is a published thing, right? I know that sits under the publications, but so there are the things that we're talking about here could be published in some form. You don't have to have a publisher to publish something, right?
Yeah, true.
Like, the website is published.
The same, right?
Yeah.
Web content and all that sort of stuff. So that and then that was, and obviously that wasn't going to work. So then we sort of knocked various other ideas around, and eventually we came up with non-traditional outputs. But I always had an issue with that because coming from a software background, software is really traditional, and I kind of hoped it was one of those terms that people would just adopt. But I've seen a lot of pushback and people saying, well, wait a minute, in my area, this output is traditional. So I do think we need to revisit what we're going to call them, even though we coined that name and people have started using it. So I don't know. We had a discussion the other day.
Is that the term NTOs has now been used so much because of what the Hidden Ref did that we've created our own mess, basically.
We've created a monster.
We've created a monster. So you now see NTOs referred to not in the UK, but elsewhere as well. However, we're doing a rapid review as part of the Ep2 study at the moment to look at how these were evaluated and approached in other ways. And there is a lot of the research coming out of Australia where their Excellence in Research Australia, which is their REF, basically. And if you think that the REF is bad, I can tell you about what Excellence in Research Australia had and the engagement and impact had. And I should actually say that the REF is an Australian invention, not a British one, but hey, so it's not any better on the other side of the world. Anyway, rapid review, there's a lot of research coming out and they refer to NTROs, non-traditional research outputs, which again doesn't solve the problem. But what it does see is that the term and the association of non-traditional and outputs is pretty much there, independent of the ref, independent of the hidden ref and before the hidden ref came along. But the NTOs, it's our mess. We're going to have to clean it up.
I mean, we could just keep NTO and rebrand it as not trusted outputs.
Ooh,
trusted.
That's too controversial.
By whom? No, that's the problem. Because again, like I trust a lot of these outputs, but it's just the ref managers do not. So
Can I just say it's a Friday afternoon. I don't think creative juices are particularly flowing right now, but I do like non-trusted. But again, I don't want to somehow degrade them in any way, shape or form because they are excellent. So we don't want to somehow put a synonym, which means that needs to be reconsidered in any way, shape or form.
So the ultimate thing is what we should be calling them is outputs.
Yes.
Right? That's what it should be because they're all outputs.
But then we don't distinguish our mission. So it's, we kind of have to say all outputs.
That's the
NTSOs, non-traditionally submitted output, is exactly what we mean, but we've already got NTOs out there. So perhaps we can just agree that after this discussion and the fact that, yes, we've taken everything on board, and we do know that the ref is referring to it as diverse outputs.
Now, you see, I don't think we'd be having this discussion if they hadn't moved to diverse outputs, because now there are two different names. One will be used by the sort of mainstream ref and one will be used by us. And so
but then again, I would like to think that the ref wouldn't have that discussion without us talking about NTOs too. So chicken and egg, and egg.
But I think because of diverse outputs appearing, I've started to call everything else majority outputs when I talk to people. Which I know is not ideal either, but it's sort of like I don't want one to be outputs and one diverse. I want them to both have a kind of a qualifier of some kind. So
well, an adjective, some type of adjective.
Yeah.
So far in our discussions, and I don't believe our discussions are finished yet, I think not traditionally submitted outputs is as close as we're getting to what the truth of the matter is. Yesterday, we were having this discussion across the Hidden Ref Committee, and actually, if you want to adequately describe the outputs that we want to see submitted, you have to use sort of 6 or 7 words in a phrase, and that's just so unwieldy to be entirely unhelpful. But I think not traditionally submitted outputs might be the way forward.
Well, that's what we're referring to. So, acronyms become acronyms, but as they move forward, acronyms end up encompassing concepts and ideas more than they end up referring to the words that actually make up the acronym in the first place. So can we just agree now, for the sake of clarity and for sake of tracking, how we've influenced the field and the ref going forward, that when hidden ref and ETI refer to NTOs, they actually mean NTSOs, because they're not talking about outputs that are not traditional for that discipline, but outputs that are not traditionally considered competitive enough to be submitted to a competitive exercise such as the ref.
I want to run that one past the community.
Put that into an acronym.
I want to see what the community wants us to use, because I think that's the right way forward. Because I always say this thing when I'm doing presentations, especially on research software engineering, that hell is being locked for eternity in a room full of academics trying to name something. And I always avoid these conversations as much as is humanly possible. But I think this is so important and so integral to our mission that we have to get that name right, and it has to be a name that the community will accept. So I think we need to push out some ideas to the community, and people can get in touch with us, of course, and tell us how much you dislike various versions of the names that we've been through. But I think it has to be the community that has the final word on this one.
So if you want to get involved in the naming process, there's hell of naming. You can find us on Blue Sky, you can find us on LinkedIn, and you can email us at wtref@hidden-ref.org, which is a change to the email address, but both of them will still get us anyway.
Well, that brings us to an end. Thank you very much for that really interesting discussion, James and Gemma. So all that's left to say is please subscribe to this podcast, and you can do that on whatever podcast platform you use. You can also subscribe on YouTube. We're really interested in hearing from you. If you have questions or you have any ideas, if you have a better idea for what an NTO should be called, so please get in touch. Take a look at the website, or email us on wtref@hidden-ref.org. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.